Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sumit, and as part of the Economic Times India Leadership Council, it's my privilege to host Mr. Rohit Karnatak from Pinkerton. In this series, we speak to senior leaders about some of the most pressing issues that face corporate India today. And sir, it's an absolute honor to host you and to talk to you here about a really pressing topic that's coming our way these days, which is around ethics in compliance. So before we begin, it'll be great if you could just say a few words of introduction, and then we'll get going.
Sure, Sumit. Good afternoon, Sumit, and thank you so much for having me for this interview. And I look forward to this interaction. And I think, yes, the topic that we're going to pick up is definitely relevant to business today. And I think I'm glad that Economic Times has picked up this topic specifically at these times when a lot of ethics, compliance, and governance, everything is under a lot of pressure and a lot of questions
Absolutely.
itself across. Sumit, I've been with Pinkerton for about 10 years and I lead their practice for them in South Asia. And, been working, Pinkerton being a global organization, has been there for about 180 years now. And we are basically into comprehensive risk management, for our global clients and clients in India as well. India, we've been there for about 15 plus years. So we've been there, we've been doing it. And I think, I might be able to add some insights, because we do a lot of investigations, with regards to compliance and corporate governance in some of those areas. I'll try to give as many antidotes and some examples as possible, so that will make this conversation more interesting for people.
My experience of risk and compliance comes from the other side, where in organizations, as part of my experience with Big Four companies as well, as an employee, it's always, oh, these risk people, they see risk in everything. Why can't we speed things up? So you would have dealt with that, and that's where my first question comes up. In fact, as a layperson or as somebody who's not from the risk and compliance world as such, we tend to use the words ethics and compliance kind of interchangeably. So, in your opinion, what is the connection between the two? What sets them apart? And if you could shed some light on this, that would be fantastic.
Sure, Sumit. And I think, as a general public and in the corporate sector, a lot of time ethics and compliance are taken as synonyms to each other, which is not true.
Right.
What actually ethics is basically more of a moral science. It's something which you are self uh, controlling yourself, or you're setting up rules which may not be as part of the law or the law of the land, right? You want to set up some high standards for yourself and you may call it ethics, right? But there could be some things which could be as per the law of the land, which you have to follow, what the government is saying, what the local governance is saying, and that makes form part of a compliance, right? So, if you are into, let's say, for example, hazardous industry like oil, right? Oil exploration, right? So your level of OHS, level of employee security, safety would be at a different level than in an ITITS, right? And that may be governed by different level of compliances and laws that you have to follow, right? But it could be a possibility that both an ITITS and an oil exploration company both may have their ethics at the same level and say that, from a perspective of honesty and the employee centric policies that we'll make, both of them may have ethics at the same level, or in fact the same ethics as well, right? So that's the larger difference. One is driven by the law, right? And one is driven by the inner self-conscience of the organization. The larger question that comes out of it, where both of them become an offshoot, is the governance. And I think largely most of the companies now are talking about governance and sustainability, right? And I think we can touch upon those points as we proceed. But the basic layman difference is the same as the compliance and ethics, as I explained.
Understood. So then it would be fair to say that anti-corruption, anti-bribery is compliance, and helping, let's say, in case there's a workplace accident or in case somebody loses their life, it would be the ethical thing to do to kind of support their family, or I mean, provide benefits which go beyond the minimum compensation prescribed by law.
Absolutely. You're right on that, Sumit. So, for example, as I gave an example of oil and ITITs, in oil exploration, the risk of human life is much more, right?
Absolutely.
And therefore, there could be different laws that may govern it, in case of a loss of life. In IT/ITS, that probability is much less, so the laws may govern it differently. But at both level, if a company says that there will be an X price to life, and both companies feel that it's the same life and the same price, unfortunately, when an incident happens, that could be their ethics, right? But a compliance would definitely say that they would have to pay a certain compensation. That could be an amount that may be defined by the labor law in that particular country. And especially, as you said, the anti-corruption and anti-money laundering, and some of them, absolutely, they are compliances. There is no country in the world, which basically says that that's allowed.
Go
So
ahead and do
yes,
it.
as
Yeah.
per the law of the land, that's what compliance is all about.
Got it. So again, the way I understand it is, sir, that compliance is a little more on the binary side. You're either in compliance or you're not complying.
Non-compliant, yeah.
But we talk about high standards of ethical behavior, or we say this organization is more ethical than that one. So how do you recommend that an organization gets seen as promoting very high standards of ethical behavior?
See, I think, Sumit, what we are seeing now is that whether it is a business which is owned by families
Right.
or owned by shareholders or stakeholders, or even in a startup ecosystem, I think there is a lot of focus on ethics these days, right? And if you go back in history and if you look at some of the organizations that have survived a period of time or have been there for a few decades, are all of those organizations where their ethics have always remained higher than their compliance. So they have definitely followed the compliances. They have also ensured that they do business as per the law, but their own individual targets as an organization or as a corporation to add or give it back more to the employee or to the society has always been much, much higher. And that has helped them to sustain throughout some of the bad patches that they have had, right? And what we've also been seeing on the other side, Sumit, is the fact that there are organizations where we see them failing. And if you will really go down and look at things more minutely, you'll find somewhere the ethics part failed first before the compliance part, right? So for example, if I am supposed to file a GST return, right, the law might say I might have a few days to file it before I raise an invoice to a client, right? But the ethics says that it should be done the same day, right? Now when the ethics and the compliance, there is a clear disconnect, right, at the leadership level. And it is always, as I keep saying, it is more of a water flow effect, right?
Right.
It is coming from top down. It can never be a bottom up approach. It has to be a top down approach, right? So when the leadership says that there is zero tolerance from our ethics and compliance perspective, that the finance has to make sure that the GST return is filed on the same day, right? That would ensure that the compliance would not largely or never fail. That reduces the possibility of failing, right? But the moment when you say as an ethic, it's okay, if it is delayed by a couple of days, but that's okay. That's where the snowball, the ball gets starts rolling. So I think, from that perspective, that is how we need to look at it.
Understood. And I mean, of course, as a student of the subject and as an enthusiast, I'm fond of picking up extreme cases. So what you're saying would be relevant in a case like, say, Enron, right, where compliance came later. First, they decided to kind of game the system and play around with it, and then, of course, all the compliance measures went for a toss.
Yeah, you're right, Sumit. Historically, as I've been saying, if you go and look at the organizations, right, largely organizations do not just fail because the compliance failed. Largely, they fail because somewhere they failed in the ethics, because it
Right.
starts from top down, right, where you start diluting compliances, right, where you start finding to read between the lines of a law to say that it does not say that if it does not say this, right?
Mhm.
That is the time when you are finding ways and you're meandering your way through the law and saying that, oh, this can be challenged this way in the court of law, so we can play things around this way as well. But an organization which has a high morale and high ethics would always say, we will just follow the law of the land the way it has been described, and we will ensure that everyone in the organization is following the law of the land, and it will remain the same whether it is for a CEO of the organization or the peon of the same organization, right? I think when you bring in that level of uniformity in the entire thing, that is where those are the organizations that really sustain, right? And that's the reason why you know it much more than me, that there is a lot of conversation around sustainability, right? It is not
Absolutely.
just about environment, it is not just about society, it is also about sustaining the ethics and the work culture throughout the organization.
So in a nutshell, what I hear you saying is that when in doubt, do the right thing.
Oh, absolutely. When in doubt, you just go back and do the right thing. What your conscience says is right. Usually our
Mm.
conscience is the best guide, right? And our organization has their own conscience, right?
Right.
And the one thing I always keep suggesting, when we talk about ethics, more than verbal, it should always be written, right? It should be something to fall back on. Leaderships may change in organizations, right? But ethics and policies should always be documented. People should, whoever is the new leader, should be able to go back to the same policy document and refer to it whenever in doubt, right? And I think some of these things really help to build the culture within the organization. And I think that's where the ethics plays a more important role.
Understood. Great. And one thing that I'm a little curious about is, so it's easy to talk about extremes. It's easy to talk about binaries and say this is right, that is wrong. In your tenure and during your experience, I'm sure you would have come across scenarios which are a little on the gray sides, which is neither black nor white. Can you tell us one or two of these stories where we can learn from, and situations that you've come across in the workplace and how exactly they were handled?
Yeah, so Sumit, absolutely. During the course of when we do our investigations or due diligence, right, we do come across different organizations, and when we do these investigations, now they are being, spread across in a different way depending upon what is the end goal of the organization that has engaged us, right? So, what basically means that if I am deciding to acquire an organization, and we are talking about a merger and acquisition, right?
Right.
The multinationals definitely want to look at the governance side of it apart from compliance. So compliance is by default there, right? But they
Of course.
definitely want to look at the compliance part of it. They want to look at the ethics part of it as well. And definitely they want to look at what are they doing from a sustainability perspective, right? Are they doing something for the environment? Are they doing something for the community at large? Where is it that they are spending their CSR funding? Are they really aligned? Is that thought process really there, right? When it comes to a smaller size of the organization, where you are just going to help them as one of your partners, in the entire ecosystem, there you are definitely working about is more about compliance part as of now. That's more about it. Now, to give you an example, is the immediate example I can think about is human resources, right? There is a law which says that we can work with employees for a certain period of time during a day and a week, and there are certain defined rules and regulations around it, right? Largely, what we've seen is that largely companies do not follow that as principle, as practice, right? So that is where the gray area comes. Now, I am supposed to work for 8 hours, right? If I'm really working for 10, 12, or 14 hours, for example, right, there is no really someone knocking at my door and saying that why are you supposed to work so late, right? Or if a supervisor is pushing a team to work too late, right? Are you really going back and talking about it? So I'll give you a very quick example of an organization that we were looking, where our client was planning to do a merger and acquisition, and they also wanted us to look at the governance model of it. So when I go to labor compliance part of it, Sumit, there was nothing wrong about them. It was absolutely perfect, whether it is PF, whether it is ESI, whatever was applicable as per the law of the land, that was being paid. And it sometimes overtimes were also being paid. And I'm not talking about a manufacturing, I'm talking about a service industry example over here. But what we could see during the COVID time, we could see the managers, forcing people to work late, or we could see as a culture that, a lot of people were, put on video calls, at later in the evenings, right, which was off working hours, right? Now, that's the gray area. If you look at from a law perspective, that's not correct. But then the gray areas, it is more about the ethics. If the HR would have strongly gone back over there, and you come from that fraternity, you'll understand, to say that no supervisor is allowed to make a call after 7 p.m. period, right? Unless there is an explicit consent from the other side that they are also wanting to participate in that call, right? Then the value system would have been different, right? And we were talking about this acquisition being done by a multinational, right? So they were a bit concerned when we reported this, because in their system, someone is not supposed to be working, or at least being pushed to or forced to work without their volunteer after a 6:30 or a 7 p.m., whatever was the time slot they had. So I think these are some of the gray areas where we see. The other gray areas where we see is in terms of the financial part in some organizations, especially the smaller size organizations. Indian ecosystem, as you know, Sumit, is made up with lot of small size organizations, right?
Right.
And these small size organizations are our vendors or our partners in the larger ecosystem, right? Now these small time partners, and some of them don't have the compliance, the governance, and all of them. They are usually very bootstrapped in terms of their working capital, and they would want to make it, so they will pay GST for one, but they would hold on to the GST to the other. Some of those aspects of things. So there is a lot of gray area over there. I think as our economy is getting more and more organized, right, and GST is that's one step in that direction. So I feel that gradually some of these organizations will come up, and the biggest example, beyond anything, for whatever we are discussing, Sumit, is the COVID situation, right? If you go back and look at 2 years, and history will talk about it, right? You could definitely make the difference between the milk and the chalk, right? There were
Absolutely.
organizations that stood up. There were organizations that stood up with their employees, right? Much beyond what the government was saying, right? To take care of their employees, to take care of the family of the employees, to take care of the bereavement, and the clear policies that defined for some of their employee losing, unfortunately, their life during COVID. And there were other organizations, you and I both know, which basically ran away, which basically shut down, or did not take care of their workers at all, right? So we had two absolute extreme spectrums, right? Now when you go back and look at ethics and governance and compliance, and you put it into that structure, you'll realize those were the bigger organizations, Sumit, which always had the ethics and the governance culture there, irrespective of the COVID situation or not, right? They were able to sustain it, right? And those smaller organizations which never had that in mind, their empathy towards their employee was missing. And that's a very clear difference, because situations like a pandemic, Sumit, happens very rarely, and that
Absolutely.
differentiates between the what is the core or the soul of an organization. It
I
bears
think
it.
those are great points, sir. And I mean, as an HR professional myself, I think it's amazing the way you link culture with ethics and compliance, because we kind of think of ethics and compliance as merely policing people and getting them to toe the line.
Yeah,
But I think that's a really critical difference that you brought in, saying ethics and compliance, or at least ethical behavior, is a crucial component of culture. It differentiates the best from the rest, and it's
true,
the way to go in case you want to make a sustainable
true,
employee centric organization. So I
true,
think
true,
it's
true, Sumit.
been
Sumit, yeah, because
enriching.
if you look at it, and if I may just add one more line to that thought
Absolutely.
process, Sumit, if you look at it, if an organization is not having that right work culture, right, forget about the labor compliance, it will build up in terms of synergies which are negative between the teams, right? And that is exactly what relates in either workplace violence, right, when we are back to office, or it would react in some kind of other harassment, because some people would react differently, because we are all dealing with human beings, right? So when we look at risk as a comprehensive risk management company, we take it as a risk, and we flag it. We say that, don't look at productivity, but also look at the risk what you are generating, because you are creating an ecosystem which is filled of lot of tension, right? And it may result in somewhere else, right? Some of the examples are some of the instances that unfortunately the HR had to face when they were letting go of people, right? And we've had those instances in whether it is Gurgaon and in some of the other places as well. And all of those are basically of pent up tensions between the management, the HR, and the employee. Right. So I think, all of these does make an impact in the long run when it comes to the risk side of it as well.
Definitely makes perfect sense.